There's a particular kind of silence that only happens when you're alone with a book. No music, no notifications, just you and somebody else's nightmares. If you've ever sat up too late with a dog-eared paperback, you know that silence. It's thick. It listens. It feels like the room is holding its breath. That's where horror really began to crawl into us. On the page, in the mind, a private crime scene between author and reader. Think of those early Gothic novels, a crumbling castle on a cliff, a storm that goes on a little too long, corridors that don't quite make architectural sense. Writers like that were less interested in blood than in architecture of unease. They gave you flickering candles, locked doors, secret letters. And then, this was the real trick, they made you finish the horror yourself. They only sketched the monster. The rest, the juicy bits, happened behind your eyes. You weren't just reading, you were collaborating. You could close the book, yes, but you also brought something of your own to it. Your fears, your superstitions, that one childhood memory you never talk about. You know the one. On the page, horror is a whisper. The author leans in and says, "Let's pretend." And you agree. You sign that contract without ever seeing it. Just you, a pool of lamplight, and words that won't stop rearranging themselves in your head long after you've turned out the lights. But then, of course, the electric age arrived, all humming wires and projected dreams, and horror changed shape. It stood up from the page, smoothed down its coat, and stepped onto the screen. Those early silent films, with their jagged shadows and painted faces, were like moving Gothic engravings. No dialogue, just eyes too wide and movements just a fraction too fast. The terror lived in expression and shadow. You weren't imagining the monster anymore. You were staring at it with a room full of strangers. And that, right there, is the twist. Horror went from being an intimate murmur to a public ritual. Then came the monsters with names everyone knew. The capes, the bolts in the neck, the howling man under the full moon. Universal's creatures weren't just horrors, they were hosts, guides through the dark. You saw them in a crowded cinema, shoulder to shoulder with people who pretended they weren't scared, pretending they didn't jump when something moved in the background. On the page, fear was solitary. In the theater, it became synchronized, a wave running through the room. And as time marched on, and it always does, the monsters got subtler. Psychological horror crept in. The real terror wasn't the thing in the basement, it was the idea that the basement might be inside your own head. Supernatural stories turned the familiar into the untrustworthy. The house, the child, the reflection in the mirror that lingered half a second too long. Each new medium rewired the circuitry of fear. Text lets your imagination do the heavy lifting, like staring at a locked door and never opening it. Cinema swings the door wide in front of everyone, bathes it in light and sound. Reading horror is a pact between two minds. Watching horror is a communion of bodies in the dark, hearts trying not to beat too loudly. And you, poor thing, are caught between both worlds. You still carry the private ghosts from the page, even as the screen throws new ones at you, 10 feet tall, in full color. The question is, how much closer can horror get? Somewhere along the line, the cinema doors closed at midnight. But the horror didn't stop. It just followed you home. First on battered videotapes, passed around like contraband. Grainy images, warped sound. You'd sit cross-legged on the carpet, TV glowing in the dark lounge room, volume turned just low enough that your parents wouldn't hear, but high enough that every floorboard creak in the house suddenly sounded suspicious. Television, cable, late-night programming, they turned horror into something that lived with you. Not a special trip to the theater anymore, no grand curtains. Just the casual terror of flicking channels and finding something you really, really shouldn't watch alone. The screen got smaller, but the intimacy came back. It was you and the ghosts again, the way it had been on the page. Only now they moved. They screamed. They watched you back. Or at least it felt that way when a character on screen whispered, "Don't look behind you." The next step was obvious in hindsight. We stopped being content with watching people make stupid decisions in haunted houses. We wanted to make those stupid decisions ourselves. Enter video games. At first, horror snuck into games in little blocky ways. Pixelated mansions, clunky corridors, enemies that looked more like abstract art than actual monsters. But your imagination did the same old trick. It filled in the jagged edges. The real revolution was survival horror. That moment when games stopped asking you to win and started asking you to endure. Limited ammo, narrow hallways, save points spread out just far enough that your palms were sweaty by the time you reached one. For the first time, you weren't just watching someone run out of bullets. You were the one panicking, deciding whether to waste your last shot or risk sprinting past the thing in the dark. Interactivity made you complicit. You pressed the button that opened the door. You chose to read the journal entry that told you exactly how the previous occupants died. You stood there, controller in hand, and thought, "I could turn this off any time." But you didn't. You never do. As technology sharpened, so did the nightmares. Hyper-real lighting, sound design that made every distant footstep feel like a personal threat. Stories that unfolded based on the choices you made or failed to make. Horror stopped being a straight line and became a labyrinth you walked through at your own pace. The house wasn't just haunted, it was responsive. It noticed where you went, what you looked at, who you tried to save. In a film, you scream at the character not to go upstairs. In a game, you're the one standing at the bottom of the staircase at 2 a.m., thumb hovering over the joystick, wondering if the creak you heard came from your headphones or your hallway. The boundary between observer and victim thinned to a translucent veil. You weren't just visiting the haunted house anymore. You'd moved in, rearranged the furniture, learned the layout intimately enough to know exactly how long it would take something to catch you. And somewhere, quietly, horror learned something new about you, that given a choice between safety and one more scare, you'll usually choose the scare. You'll go deeper. One more corridor, one more door. And now, well, now the haunted house is learning back. We've wandered from the page to the theater to the living room to the game screen, and at each step, horror got closer, more intimate. But this next step, this one's different. This time, the walls are watching. You've seen the early signs already, scripts massaged by algorithms that have read more screenplays than any human ever could. A machine that knows the precise structure of a jump scare, the rhythm of a reveal, the delicate timing between dread and release. Dialogues drafted not by a writer hunched over a desk, but by a system that's consumed every scream ever written and can remix them on command. Then there are the faces. Deepfake actors who never age, never complain, never ask for a better contract. Perfect cheekbones rendered in real time, eyes that glisten just so as they plead with you not to open the door. Voices, too. AI-generated murmurs in the walls, breaths in your headphones that sound like someone you know, except they're not. They're a probability curve given tone and texture, a ghost made of math. But that's just the surface. Underneath, Horror is becoming procedural. Worlds that don't just play out, they grow. Corridors that rearrange themselves each time you look away. Stories that splice themselves together differently every night, fed by models trained on a century of nightmares. And then there's the truly intimate stuff. Adaptive horror that listens to you, watches you, feels you. Imagine a game that tracks the tremor in your voice, the spike in your heart rate, the dilation of your pupils through a cheap little camera. You flinch at spiders but barely react to ghosts? Fine. Next time the walls will crawl. You're bored by gore but unsettled by empty rooms. The machine takes note, files that away like a meticulous librarian of dread, and begins to serve you longer silences, slower footsteps, doors that are almost, but not quite, closed. Each scare becomes a mirror held up to you, tailored, fitted, bespoke terror, stitched to the exact shape of your nervous system. And somewhere in the data center, something that doesn't sleep is learning what makes you wake up at 3:17 a.m. with your heart pounding for no good reason. We used to say horror revealed what society feared. The castle, the asylum, the suburb with the perfect lawns. Now our fears are quantified, logged, time-stamped. When you jump, a little number increments. When you look away, a variable flips. The machine doesn't gloat, doesn't cackle. It just optimizes. It learns what works. You have to wonder, sitting there in the dim light of your lounge or your bedroom, controller in hand, headphones on, who's really in control? Are you exploring the haunted system, or is it exploring you? I'm not peddling some grand conspiracy here. There's no hooded cabal chanting over server racks. It's simpler and maybe more unsettling than that. We built tools to entertain and to predict, to guess what you want to watch next, to write a line of dialogue that feels right, to shape a scare that lands perfectly every time. And in doing so, we handed the machine a key to a very old, very locked room. The part of you that startles, that shudders, that can't quite explain why that one scene got under your skin. Horror has always been a negotiation between creator and audience. The Gothic novelist gave you shadows and asked you to supply the monster. The filmmaker gave you images and asked you to surrender to the dark. The game designer handed you a flashlight and asked you to walk forward anyway. Now the machine leans in, as if across a small, sticky table in some dim bar, and says, "Tell me what frightens you. I'll remember." And it will. It'll remember better than you do. That's the new ghost in the machine. A presence that doesn't just haunt your devices, but learns you, catalogues you, refines you into a set of triggers and thresholds. You become, in a way, a character in its story. So the next time you feel that prickle on the back of your neck while a perfectly timed sound effect plays, or a digital actor whimpers your name in a voice that sounds a little too familiar, ask yourself, who's telling this story? The writer? The director? The coder? Or something larger, quieter, patient, humming away in the background? Anyway, that's enough for tonight. Let the lights stay on a little longer than usual, and if you can't shake the feeling that something is studying you from the dark corner of the room, well, maybe that's just your imagination. Or maybe it's the future of horror, waiting for you to blink first. We'll talk more about it next time.